better understanding this fantastic place we get to live next to. And so she will tell us more about the urban ocean in her Cocktails Fishtales presentation with us tonight. So give it up for Cocktails Fishtales.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you for hosting. Tell me at any point if you can't hear me, because I feel like being this high up, my voice might trail off for some reason. I don't know why. But let me know if you can't hear anything. Okay, so we live in some pretty turbulent times. We're pretty blessed in the Pacific Northwest to not be having sea level rise go quite as quickly as it's happening in other parts of the world. But in a lot of places, we're seeing this convergence of factors, this shifting patterns of inequality, altered disturbance regimes with massive flooding, sea level rise driving that in a lot of places, and then enormous risks to human well-being and ecosystem well-being. And cities are really on the front lines of this. So almost 50% of cities are already reporting that they're dealing with the effects of climate change. This manifests in all sorts of different things. This graph you have on the right is showing when surveyed, a UN program surveying the different risks associated with climate change for cities. Breaks down into a lot of different categories. They're not just ecological, they're social, they're all intertwined, and they're really complex. Most at risk are vulnerable populations, and the risks that are really important, especially in urban coasts, are these ones: sea level rise, food security, extreme weather events that we're hearing about a lot now, rising temperatures, access to fresh water. We all listen to the news, we all know these things are occurring. And it's not, I think, when you're coming into this world and into this profession at a time when there's so much change happening, it's really important, I think, to focus on what we can do to weather these threats. So we need new tools to build adaptive capacity, to make sure we can handle these changes that are coming up better. We need strategies that are co-developed with vulnerable communities. It can't just be a top-down approach. And we need to be guided by multiple forms of knowledge, because there are people who have lived on these lands for a lot longer than us, and they have had approaches that have worked, and turning to others to find that expertise and integrate it into our planning is really critical. Also, then we want to build insights from nature. And I think there are a couple different species that are kind of the poster children for adaptive capacity in urban settings. They're all terrestrial, they all live on land, the ones that we hear about most often. But here are some of our commonly featured ones on the bottom right. So raccoons, you've seen a ton of. We've got a falcon, pigeons, house sparrows, and our tiny rat. This is brown rat. I would argue that Norway rats have done that better. But we're familiar with all of these. These are species that embody adaptive capacity. They've been able to handle the changes that we presented for them. And I think from them, there are lessons to be learned, things we can learn about how to better adapt to a changing world. So urban ecology is the study of organisms and ecosystems in urbanized landscapes. Historically, it has really been a terrestrial endeavor. It's something that really people have studied on land, or really barely touched the surface in the marine realm. So my work is focused on urban marine ecology. What are the kind of urban processes that are characteristic of ecosystems underwater in coastal cities? There are several main foci. I guess it feels weird saying foci. The focus of my work is kind of threefold. One is understanding just how urban marine ecosystems work, how they function, how they're structured. Identifying the adaptive characteristics of marine life that live in urban sensories, and then using these insights to expand our own adaptive capacity as urban communities. So this has taken me on several different avenues of inquiry and different types of projects that range from purely ecological research to really applied kind of eco-engineering work. The ones I will talk about today, because we don't have time for everything, is first to tell you about urban octopus, second about seawall ecology, and then in the third part I'm going to cram in as much as I can about what my lab at UWT does currently. All of that is kind of in flux, so I won't go into a ton of detail, but hopefully that's a good launching off place for questions for anything you guys might be interested in. Okay, so urban octopus. Let's see, to start, urban terrestrial ecology, since terrestrial systems are really where we have most of the theory about urban ecology that we kind of fall back on, suggests that urbanization leads to this rise in mesopredators. So by mesopredators, I mean these guys, some of them we've already talked about, things like raccoons, crows. These are medium-sized consumers that themselves have predators, but they also feed on other things lower in the food chain. And on land, this is thought to be the result of a couple things. One, there's an increase in shelter in a lot of places, that their built environment creates habitats for these critters to live in. Also, B, as we're all aware, if we put the trash out and it gets raided by a raccoon, the abundance of food that we provide in cities is a helpful thing that can stimulate population densities. And on top of that, urbanization has gotten rid of a lot of the apex predators that would keep some of these guys in check. So that allows their densities to actually be higher in urban areas than they would be in other areas. And we refer to that as synanthropic. These are synanthropic species because their densities are higher in urban centers. So I wanted to know if giant Pacific octopus might fit this bill. I think you probably are familiar with these already, since I give a red octopus on hand. So this is the larger sibling species of reds, lovingly referred to as GPOs by local divers. It's the largest known octopus species known. It can, in theory, range up to 10 meters when stretched out tip to tip. I've never seen one quite that big. That's a record, and there's some debate. You know, when you're underwater, you're like, it was so big, but maybe not quite that big, but they're pretty big. They live all the way around the, where you see blue here. So everywhere from here, further south to California, and then over to Japan. They themselves, they're considered mesopredators because they have prey like benthic invertebrates of various different kinds, but they're also consumed by predators themselves. So we think of them as mesopredators, even though they're enormous. And they're present in urban estuaries. So that kind of laid the groundwork for me to ask this question. They're mesopredators, we see them in cities. Are they synanthropic? Was the question. And if so, why? If not, okay, so is anyone a diver? So you've seen or has seen these at the aquarium, maybe. They love hiding holes. Whatever we provide them, they seem to love. And it can include anything from a corrugated pipe, like you see on the right, sunken, smaller shipwrecks are popular abodes. On the bottom, kind of in the middle here, you've got a toilet bowl. I've actually seen one under a toilet bowl. Any old thing will be fine, it seems. So my first question here, are they more common in urban areas? This is something that's a little hard to get at as one person underwater as a diver, right? They're so big, the scale that I'm able to survey in the time that they're getting up, moving around, doing things, it's not really sufficient to capture data that get at this question. So I relied on data from the REEF program. This is a citizen science dive program. It's been pretty active in the Puget Sound region since 2000, but longer in other places. I was using data from 2000 to 2016 because I did this project a while ago. Of those years, we came down to 5,792 surveys, and those were done across 176 sites. So way more than I would have been able to cover as a single diver. I wanted to correlate that with patterns of urbanization intensity. Because we were just talking about mapping of the marine benthos, it's really hard to actually say this is an urban marine environment just from mapping layers. What we have to do is rely on the characteristics of nearby land and just say the nearest locations on land, how urban are those locations. So we compiled geospatial data layers from land around our marine sites and pulled out several different things. First, the population density, the percent of impervious cover, the proportion of the shoreline that was armored, the road density, and then the proportion of land that was characterized as high density development. And all of these correlate a lot, and so you have to reduce the dimensionality of them to use them in a statistical model. I won't go into how we did that, but the outcome of the process we used to do that was called PC1. So PC1 is our urbanization index.
I'm sorry, armored, what does that mean in this context?
Oh, armored.
Armored.
Yeah, so an armored shoreline is anything with a seawall or a bulkhead, something other than a natural shoreline, where it's protected from erosion. Okay, so we also considered bottom tide, visibility, depth, month, year, habitat type, and then we use the Pacific Decadal Oscillation as a proxy for temperature. So we're trying to say, okay, we have all these natural variables, and then we have this urbanization index, PC1. Which ones are correlated with octopus distribution patterns? So this is the result of that modeling study. So with this plot, the line down the middle is basically indicative of no relationship. If there's no relationship between the variable you see on the left and the octopus presence absence, then the point will end up somewhere around 0. Where there's a positive relationship, the point is a little bit to the right, and a negative relationship, the point is a little bit to the left. So right off the bat, we can see, okay, there's a positive relationship with depth. As you go deeper, you're more likely to find octopus. There is a slight positive relationship with rocky habitat. So in rocky areas, you're more likely to see these guys in the soft sediment. Overall, there's not a strong effect from PC1, from our urbanization index. It's actually negative. But when you look at the variables on the bottom, there is a pretty strong relationship as you go down in depth. So here's the pattern we found. As in shallow areas, not a strong relationship, potentially even negative. In deep urban settings, you tend to find more octopus than in deep settings that are more rural. So this graphic is just to summarize that. In the shallows, we see slightly fewer octopus in the urban settings, but in depth, we see more octopus, a lot more octopus in deeper waters. So we were kind of like, why might this be? A couple different possibilities, right? The first was, well, maybe the crab, the food resources that are available in urban places are better at depth. Or maybe it's something related to junk. We're not really sure. So to get at that, we did a couple different follow-up studies. So the first one was to look at octopus middens. Octopus are really great to study because they leave their junk, their trash, from what they ate right outside of their homes. And so you can go collect it, lay it all out on a table, figure out what all is there, even measure it to get a sense of size structure of the prey items. That gives you a really good idea of diet. So this is Amy Olson. She was an undergraduate researcher at the time. She's now a researcher, I can't remember her official title, at the Seattle Aquarium. And her capstone project was to go to 24 different sites, collect midden piles from 46 different octopus dens, and lay them all out and count all the different things that were in there. As capstone projects go, I felt Amy is amazing, and I felt kind of bad for her because often we'd be like diving on a Sunday. Monday morning she would have class, and so she would bring her bag of octopus mittens with her to class, and it smells so bad. Terrible thing if you're, in college. Anyway, but she did a great job. The map here on the right shows you all the different locations where she sampled. And she found, not too far from what we might expect, they really like crab. Rescuers octopus love crab, it seems to be their favorite food. They also eat a surprising number of dingle shells, Podidesmus, which is really small in terms of biomass. So we started referring to those as like the potato chips that they were eating. It's just maybe they pop them off the rock and eat them for a little crunchy something. But it's not, it can't be all that much in the way of sustenance. Crab seems to be the bulk of what they're eating in terms of biomass. Their diet was highly variable though, and there was no significant relationship with our urbanization index, PC1. So it doesn't look like what they're eating is the driver of what the pattern we saw related to urbanization. The next thing we did were a series of video transect surveys, and here we were looking at whether there was a correlation between octopus abundance and anthropogenic debris. If you're a diver or if you've been snorkeling, you might be like, yes, there is a relationship. We decided to just make sure of this by going to 4 different paired sites. And at these sites, you had 2 different locations that were right next to each other, one with an extensive amount and one with limited amounts of debris. So by debris, I mean like any sunken vessel, appliances that people dropped overboard. So what else have you seen? Anything. Garbage statues, like tons of things.
So all the things.
All the things.
Satellite dishes.
What's that?
Satellite dishes.
Oh, I haven't seen that yet. That sounds impressive.
Believe me, that'd be
So we did this at 2 different depths, and we did octopus counts at each depth. We also had, so in the video surveys, we had these lasers mounted to the video camera. They're 9 centimeters apart. So because we know that they're 9 centimeters apart, and we can see in the image where the lasers point, we can then measure the object that the lasers are on using those 2 points. And that results in all sorts of images. I really like the one on the right because it looks like a robot to me. It's a chassis on its side, or a robot, depending on your perspective. And then on the bottom here, there were many, many people involved in this that were super helpful. But here's what we found. So at those paired sites that had a lot of debris, that's where we found the octopus. And paired sites without debris, there were 0 octopus. So this pattern does follow, or does suggest that abundance is correlated with debris. We don't have a good data set that tells us the distribution of debris at a fine resolution with depth. That would be really helpful to confirm whether that's why we're seeing the pattern that we saw here. Perhaps there's more junk at depth in cities than elsewhere. I know in my neighborhood, so I live in Delridge in Seattle, and definitely, that's it's a place where some people go to dump things, and I think if you're going to dump your washing machine over the side of a boat, you probably go a little bit away from shore. So I don't know if it's just that there's tons of junk at depth, but that's kind of what we hypothesize. We hope to get more data on at some point with better mapping. The bottom line here, what we learned, if you're standing on the Seattle or Tacoma waterfront, most likely there's an octopus in deeper water, not very far from you. They're really densely populating these areas. They do appear to be synanthropic, but only within certain depth ranges. So that's a nuanced finding. It's not synanthropic across the board. It appears to not be related to prey. It does appear to be tied to anthropogenic debris. Any questions before I move on? Yeah.
So the role of the debris is what? Habitat? It's not anything they're feeding on.
It could be. So they forage around rocky structures. So it could be some combination of the 2. Because crab is such a big part of their diet, and a lot of crab don't need much in the way of rocky habitat, I think probably the main mechanism is shelter, but we don't know.
Did you measure the frequency of crab? Did the crab population go up deeper and things of that nature?
We did, because of how mobile crabs are and how on mobile we are as divers, we didn't feel like we were able to get a good enough resolution on that. It's abundance of crab along with abundance of
And it
octopus.
happened that there was more octopus food in the debris at depth than where there was no debris.
Right.
So they hide even the debris also.
Right. I mean, we did have some mittens that were from deeper sites. So, and we were pretty well covered on that front, and we did see a pattern there. But it would be great to get octopus mittens too.
Liza? So, did you put a value on any of the findings? Because I'm thinking if you're a fan of octopus, this is good news.
An economic value?
Well, or going forward, public policy, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I didn't. While I was doing this work, there's the big octopus pop-up at Cove 2. I don't know if folks heard about that, but somebody caught a giant Pacific octopus at a really popular dive site. Because octopus are shellfish, you can't, and for other reasons, you're not allowed to spear them. So if you're catching octopus, you're basically wrestling it, which is crazy, if you ask me. And someone did that at a really popular dive site, and it triggered a whole process with Fish and Wildlife to set aside several different locations to be protected areas. You know, in terms of population dynamics, overall, over time, we have seen octopus declines because of temperature. But relative to other parts of their range, I don't know that we have too much reason to worry about their population size. That's not to say that it's not important to protect them for other reasons, but our findings suggest that it's not. They're not really a huge risk.
So you said that the octopus like a depth, but obviously you aren't diving to 300 feet.
Right.
So,
So there are divers collecting data at 24 meters.
Okay.
Yeah, wouldn't me.
But that means we have a huge portion of Puget Sound that's below
course.
your normal dive range.
Yeah. Yeah, and that would be great to get at with other types of data collection.
Somebody other than you.
Somebody other than me, for sure. Was there more that you're just wondering
Well,
about that?
I was just thinking that there's a lot of unknowns.
For sure. That
Because the
definitely
octopus,
agree.
if the crabs aren't living at 300 feet, then maybe they aren't either.
It's true, yeah.
Irrespective of what the habitat is.
Yeah, habitat, food, all the critical ones. I'm not sure about.
What does synanthropic mean?
Synanthropic means that you have a higher density where there's a higher density of people. It's a positive correlation between those two.
I'm surprised that one of your variables isn't fresh water. Estuaries, I mean, most urban areas, I see dumping lots of fresh water
Yeah.
into the ocean.
Yeah. So the reason for that is that we have really poor data on freshwater inputs.
Where you could just look at the how salty the water is itself.
Right. You can for the sites that we actually did where we did the sampling for like the parent sampled sites, we do collect salinity there. But for all those sites that are sampled by reef, we don't have actual salinity measurements. In other studies, we have tried to use salinity estimates from a hindcast simulation model that is run by Seattle, UW Seattle. Salinity is a huge factor. It co-varies with a ton of urbanization-related patterns. And it definitely, I think we don't even know if average salinity has gone up or down over time in places like Elliott Bay. Because we've redirected the Cedar River, we've done these incredible changes that have taken up some of the freshwater inputs. At the same time, we've covered everything in impervious surface. That increases the input of rainfall by like 80%. And we don't know what the net effect is. So salinity is a huge area that we need more data on, but we're really lacking on the data effect.
But Gig Harbor, there are octopus, but very rare. And I think some of that is because of the amount of fresh water that goes into Gig Harbor.
I can see that, yeah. It's definitely not comfortable, I'm sure.
We were seeing a GPO under the Maritime Pier for a couple periods of the night.
It exists, but it's just,
Yeah.
Did you look at the size of octopus at all?
I tried.
Could you repeat it, please?
Did we look at the size of octopus at all? I tried. They're really hard to get good size measurements on. I was really hoping we could measure suction cups, but that relationship of suction cup to total size apparently is not well verified and not very consistent. So we were not able to. The only way to get size would have been to wrestle like that guy did in Cove 2, bring them up to the surface and then do some pure biomass. We didn't do that.
So I'm struggling with, is this good news or not? Because should you be looking at the biodiversity of what is happening deeper, like all the toilet bowls and washing machines thrown in there? Did you look at that at all?
Yeah, so we've got a ton of different projects going on. A lot of them look at biodiversity. We look at the size structure of things over urbanization gradients. There's definitely a biodiversity loss as you go towards cities. It's not part of this project, but it is definitely a pattern.
So I should not be throwing my junk in the water.
Right, yeah, better not to. All right, we will cruise on to some other ones. So this is published in a paper I'm happy to share if anyone is interested. But we will move on to hearing about seawall ecology. So this work I did mostly in Singapore. This is where I did one of the postdocs that I did. So the seawalls there look quite different than our seawalls. Our seawalls are like piles of boulders along the shoreline. Their seawalls serve the purpose of both protecting the shoreline and then really working as breakwaters, what we would call a breakwater. But they are all kind of one continuous thing. And the way that we organize the rocks is very different. It's very organized. Everything's shuffled into place so that it's perfectly smooth, really homogeneous surfaces, and then they're usually using some sort of mortar to kind of hold them in place. Just in case anyone needs a point of reference, Singapore is located at the southern tip of the Malaysian Peninsula. It's a city-state. It has one of the highest GDPs anywhere in the world. And they have covered almost the entire, like 90-some-odd% of the shoreline with seawalls. And partly that's because they're really susceptible to sea level rise. They're right at the equator. Part of it is because it's very convenient for land reclamation. But so I went to Singapore because they had given the National University of Singapore a $5 million grant to look at what the effect of that seawall coverage is on biodiversity. And we were tasked both with studying that and then with trying to develop techniques that increase biodiversity after seawalls have been put in at such a large scale. Here are some scenes from the Singapore shoreline. So you can see pretty urban. There are some natural reefs. The one on the left is considered one of the natural reefs there, even though it's got a giant tire on it. There's a lot of artificial structures, like what you see in the center photo, and then the seawalls again look like this, and they're all around the island. Even when they don't have mortar in between them, the rocks are very carefully organized to make it very smooth. So Dr. Lynette Lope was who I was really excited to work with there. She has done this incredible work looking at, it's got a lot of value for theoretical ecology in terms of the relationships between physical and structural complexity and biodiversity. But in addition to that, she's designed all these really cool tiles, basically, and she adds seawalls to enhance the diversity. They create all these little nooks and crannies for different critters to live in, and they look really neat, too. So I really focused, or what I'll talk about just for today is one portion of the work that we did there, which was looking at algal turfs. So this type of filamentous, fuzzy stuff that you see on the right is a big part of what I study because it is by far the most dominant thing that you see in urban settings, and that seems to be the case globally, across cities, coastal cities around the world. And in the intertidal zone, they occupied about 100% of space in most cases, unless there was a limpet or something cruising around making a little patch to clear algal turf. It was mostly this. And strangely, no one was, I worked with a lot of students there and with other grad students, undergrads, other postdocs as well. Nobody was really keen on algae, and I'm not sure if that's just because tropical algae is not, we really love our algae here, and that's maybe not the case everywhere. But we really didn't know what these were even comprised of. So I was trying to look first at just species composition, but then also species interactions, because you see in this picture, it doesn't look like much, but there are by using just a cup, pushing it against the rock and using just a spackle knife, and it would get a good little cookie of algal turf for me to bring back to lab and study. And then I was doing all sorts of microscopy to try and identify what all was in there. Right away, I was able to see these were just really complex matrices of all sorts of species like wrapped up together. And they were holding on to each other with lots of different connections. Some of them have holdfast, like suction cups that they attach to each other. Some of them have these long tendrils where they're reaching out and kind of grabbing each other nearby. And then some have these little rhizoidal filaments that look similar to what you'd think of with different fungi and other like really small mosses. So I went around and tracked who is attached to who. That was the first thing I was looking at. And this is just at the level of genus. So all the names you see on the right are genera of algae. Within those, there can be 10s, 20s, more species than that even. So super diverse and super complex in terms of who is attached to who. There were 34 genera in total. Average samples contained 17 genera, and a sample truly was like this big, the size of a penny. And they were highly connected, so 287 unique linkages in this network, if you're thinking about it as a network. On average, there were 37 different unique connections in a single sample. It's like incredible connectivity happening here. So first I want to know, okay, are they hierarchical? Like when we think about epiphyte relationships on land, there's a tree, things live on that, other things live on that. That's kind of, that hierarchical nature of things is kind of implicit in our understanding of epiphyte relationships. So is that the case here? I went through, used network analysis to try and get this. Just for the sake of time, I won't get into the detail of these too much. Basically, I found that they're totally non-hierarchical. Everybody's holding on to everybody else, and there's no clear pattern as to who is on bottom and who's on top, for lack of a better way of saying it. They're also really decentralized, so there are some kind of key connectors, a couple genera that are key connectors, but they are kind of flexible, and you can play that role when you look between locations. And they don't absolutely have to be there for the turf network to apparently to exist and to persist. So in that sense, they're interchangeable. So what are the implications of that first? These are kind of self-organizing. These fit a lot of the criteria we think of in chaos dynamics and complexity theory of really resilient systems. They're not centralized. They don't rely on any one type of critter to persist. They can survive in any different combination, attached to whoever is nearby. It kind of defies our expectations as ecologists because we would think that all of these organisms living in a really similar niche would outcompete each other at some point, and for some reason, collectively, this sort of network structure that's not happening in these systems. And so they're self-organizing, they're flexible, and they seem to be hedging. There's multiple connection points for staying attached. That's the main risk for these guys. So this got me thinking about how we can kind of build this into our different systems, not only for how we construct eco-shorelines, but how we think about resilience building in urban settings generally. These diverse networks are really critical, partnerships, things like this. And this has kind of been the gateway for what has been my research at University of Tacoma. Before I get into that stuff, which is our current work, I want to talk about some of the kind of sub-questions that it spun off as a result. So because I was spending all this time looking at the tiny world of algae, it led me to questions like this. Does the construction material used to make seawalls affect how algal turf grows and what types of algal turf grow? What species utilize seawalls turf? So like which other critters are utilizing these complex complex networks of algae? Does sedimentation rate or hydrodynamic conditions mediate these interactions? And then can we cultivate non-filamentous seaweeds? Oops. So, little carpets of algae aren't exactly the most preferred version of seaweed that people want to engage with. They're certainly not going to have a lot of economic value. So are there ways we can cultivate other types of seaweeds on seawalls? So we did a couple different experiments here, all of these led by different undergrads. Judy looked at this question of does alloturf grow equally well on different types of materials? So she went and got all these different types of stones, put them out in these experimental strips that we put on seawalls, and then we watched what grew over time. She had them out there for 3 months and then analyzed them for percent cover. At the end of that, we found that the percent cover of algal types did not differ between the tiles, so it doesn't seem to matter what type of material you use for your seawall, at least in this sort of tropical setting. Algal turfs like them all the same. Rachel did work looking at cryptic fauna, so all the tiny little critters that live in algal turfs. She was wondering what are the major groups of cryptic fauna associated with seawall turf algae. These are all on the right. These are pink because they're dyed with rose bangle, so normally all of your fauna wouldn't be bright pink, even though that's fun. A lot of what she found in here were these tiny little harpacticoid copepods. They make up the majority of what was living in these turf algae, and they're super abundant. So, poor thing had to count in one sample 500 harpacticoid copepods in a sample that was like that big. But she did an amazing job. She also wanted to know then, do cryptic fauna supported by turf algae change with hydrodynamic conditions? So for this, we did a reciprocal transplant experiment. We had the protected side and an exposed side of one of those seawalls that came out and made more of a breakwater configuration. And we took algal samples from both sides and flipped them to the other side to see if the community of little critters living in them would change or if they would stay the same. So on the left here is, so exposure, sorry, it's so small. So you have total abundance on the y-axis, exposure on the on the x. And you have exposed is in the lighter color, protected is in the darker color. What we found basically is that it is totally a function of hydrological conditions. In higher exposure, with more wave action, that type of thing, you have more copepods. And if you switch these to the other location, that reverses, the harpacticoids go away, and vice versa if you're going from protected to exposed. So how you design these seawalls and what kind of hydrodynamic conditions result from your design does affect what's living there and pretty significantly. She did this with a lot of sewing, hand sewing. She made it these little transplant units. So just some fun things to see how she did the actual experiment. It was a cool thing to watch it roll. And this is just another way. Oh, this is getting those transplant results. Basically what I just summarized. So I'm going to zoom through. Let's see. We'll really quickly talk about fish, and then one other thing before going to current work. So this is Dylan. He was looking at the fish that were using the turf communities on seawalls. But apparently for fish, it's a pretty great place to be. He found that there were all sorts of fish. Oh, I do have video. I lied. Utilizing all sorts of fish utilizing the seawalls. We'll just give it. You can imagine this fish swimming around.
So that if you maybe try going backwards and then forward, it might play again.
There we go.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so you see that foraging on the bottom left there. He was basically counting how many times fish were doing that to really get a sense of were they actually This was the case, especially in comparison to adjacent reefs. So they seem to be using the seawall turf more than they're using the turf algae habitats and other habitats that are on just the natural reef that's nearby, which is interesting. Okay, he did another round of experiments also, just to look at what the effect is. If we could mechanistically demonstrate this pattern. So he was taking natural substrates and then tiles that were kind of repurposed from another experiment with reduced natural kind of standard levels of the algal turf, reduced levels where he scrubbed it off, and then totally bare. And lots of little details here, but he found that damsels in particular are feeding less on the seawall turf algae with high sedimentation. So this was, yeah, I didn't explain that well at all, but these 4 different treatments on the bottom, in addition to that, he was adding sediment to see if it changed whether they were foraging there. And high sedimentation isn't apparently a bother to them. Okay, last one. This one is one that we're kind of building off of a lot now, so I wanted to make sure to get to it. KD was looking at the different types of seaweeds that we can cultivate on seawalls if we add kind of troughs of water that retain the water at low tide. Can we actually grow seaweed in these cases? So these are 2 things that are really not common on seawalls, but they're really useful for we eat them. They're useful for all sorts of different products. So carrageenan is in like your ice cream. It's a thickener. It's used in a lot of different products that we use every day. So she put these planters at 3 different tidal heights and was looking at survivorship of the algae that she put in there. Basically, at middle and high tidal heights, having these containers that retain water allowed her to grow seaweed pretty effectively at a rate that was consistent with like seaweed farmers a little bit farther offshore out in the open ocean. At lower tidal heights, where you have a lot more wave action, they did not do so well. So that was a key thing from this. Okay, so I want to zoom through that just to give you a quick rundown. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure there's more time for questions. Our current project, so this is my current lab at University of Tacoma. We're 16, I think now. And we've got a couple really exciting things going on. First is just looking at an inventory of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and equity in marine resources across the Puget Sound area and locally. So we're doing this in a lot of different ways. The main projects happening right now are looking at squid fishing in different places in Puget Sound, looking at metals levels, which our initial results, metals levels in these guys are super high, especially arsenic. So you might be hearing about that in the not too distant future. We're looking at bulk kelp distribution patterns relative to urbanization intensity all throughout Puget Sound. And we're also looking at something called the luxury effect. So the luxury effect is really well documented on land. It's basically this positive relationship between income and variables that co-vary with that, like high education, attainment. And it's looking at species richness in relation to that. So where there's greater affluence, you have greater species richness. So on land, that's a really clear pattern. We wanted to see if that is a pattern that we find underwater. So far, we've looked at Seattle and Tampa, because that's where there are available data sets that allow us to do that. Preliminary results look like there's a pretty strong positive correlation there as well.
When you say richness, do you mean the richness of the human population?
No, sorry, species richness, the number of species present.
Okay, so where there are lots of species present, what else changed? What are the
Where there's greater affluence, there is greater biodiversity.
And why is that?
Why is that? Yeah, so that's the key question. On land, a lot of it is about what we plant, the resources we have available to us to, plant lots of different trees, which facilitate different birds and different organisms. Underwater, water, we're not planting anything. And so that mechanism, that question of why is that is really important. I think it's probably related to pollution. That's my first guess. But we're super early in that process. Related to pollutants. I think it's probably related to pollutants in the marine pond. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to your seawall discussion.
Okay. You want to talk about turf networks?
I beg your pardon?
Nobody wants to talk about that. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, you paid me to bring it up, so. Yeah. So you looked at, first of all, it was in an area of the world that's not here. So I'm assuming the algae life is quite different. But my question is, you looked at the construction materials of the seawall, but was there any evaluation of how it was made? Because many of them here are perpendicular, and so the washback scrubs the beach, and so you lose a lot of the habitat, I assume, that these kind of guys might like to glom onto. So does that inform policy about bulkheads going forward in terms of you could have them, but it's got to be gradual or anything like that? That was my question.
Yeah, so I think there are some overlaps with the seawall ecology we were looking at in Singapore and here. There are limitations to that as well. Algal turf is definitely dominant here, but it tends to be dominant in subtidal, so not as much in the intertidal zone. And I think certainly the way we construct breakwaters affects what's going on in subtidal locations. So I've done a lot of sampling like on the inside and outside of Des Moines Marina or like Edmonds Marina, places like that. It's quite different what is present in those two locations. Turf algae seems to be pretty abundant everywhere so far as I can tell. So I do think hydrodynamic conditions are really important to factor in, and that as marina construction design is advancing, I think that's a pretty common theme now. Like increasing your flushing rates is a good idea, and that you can design it to do that. Whether algal turf is the reason to do that is not clear to me. I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done here to see which critters are really most important in those differences.
Thank you.
Okay, so some other, some other things we have going on right now, we're trying to look at kind of the biogeochemical cycling of turf algae that's here. We've done some initial studies where we are enriching turf algae with different levels of nutrients. So higher levels of nutrients reflect places with a lot of urban runoff. And we're also increasing temperature to simulate effects of climate change. And we're finding some interesting results so far where you have excess nutrients and elevated temperature. It appears to shift turf algae from being a net carbon sink to a net carbon source, which is really interesting if we're going to try and expand up understanding what the effect of urbanization is overall in these systems at a larger scale. But again, we're really early in those analyses. And then the last thing my lab focuses a lot on is trying to restore urban shorelines that are already going to have seawalls, they're already going to have bulkheads. There are places where we can't take the seawalls down for various reasons relating to erosion control. How can we design them better is the question. A lot of what we're doing right now is trying to take invasive sargassum, which is excluding kelp from regrowing in a lot of places, and integrating it into new building materials. We've been making insulation panels, working with the engineering school to try and test how well is it working as insulation. And then I have two students right now working on using sargassum as a replacement for hempcrete. So hempcrete is a green building material solution that's sort of a concrete, sort of a kind of earthen mud material, but you can use this invasive seaweed as the biomass in place of hemp, and it has some interesting potential uses. We're doing 3D printing with sargassum and a bunch of other projects like that. All of this we're trying to do in a participatory, collaborative way. So this is a design thinking workshop we held in Seattle with designers when we were first getting going on some of the sargassum questions. Overall, we're trying to approach this from a perspective of justice and really making sure that we're working with communities that we serve at UW Tacoma well, we think you should do this with your sargassum. It's something that should be co-developed and really be integrating concerns from a variety of different people and groups. Okay, so with that, here are my acknowledgements. I'll take more questions because I didn't have them.
Woohoo!
Other questions? Yeah.
Materials and construction was a big part of your presentation. What about, sinking tires or old ships, or is that in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, we've done so. Let's see. The projects that I've worked on with that are really trying to map globally the extent of what we call ocean sprawl. So that's our term for anything that's just the junk that we're throwing out there. Tire reefs are part of that for sure. I can send some of the papers we put out there on how extensive that is and what the potential negative effects are. We've done a lot on that. I'm not doing anything on that right now because the state is trying to get rid of a lot of the tire reefs that are out there. I think the negative effects of it are pretty well established. There's so many different types of materials you can focus on, and so trying to develop some basic conceptual models of what the effect is was kind of our first round of priorities in research. So yes, we've done some things on that. There's more that could be done always. Yeah.
So, can you tell us more about sargassum?
Sure.
So where did it come from?
Yeah.
And, why are we having a problem with it?
Why are we having a problem? So, okay, Sargassum uticum is an invasive species from Japan. In Japan, it provides a lot of structural complexity for different critters to live on. It was introduced here in the early to mid 1900s. And over just the course of my PhD, I watched it spread all throughout Puget Sound. The reason we think it's a problem is that it's taking over habitat where kelp forests used to be and have died off. And by it being there, it's a perennial, so it keeps coming back every year. By being there, we think that it may be preventing kelp forests from reestablishing. So anything we can do to try and, incentivize pulling it out of the water is good. Right now, it makes basically a bathtub ring around all of Puget Sound.
Well, is there a citizen science thing? I mean, is there something that we can do?
Yeah, we can pull sargassum. And make concrete structures. I mean, I think there's we definitely are gonna need a lot of hands to try and tackle the problem. It's complex in certain places because, for instance, there are some locations where herring are using sargassum as a breeding structure or for their eggs. So there are some avenues we need to go down and work through and cross-check before we just start pulling it all out. But we're trying to lay the groundwork for that now so that in a couple years we can really just get in there and try and get control of it.
So how are you harvesting it?
The stuff we've done so far is by hand. We did do an experiment last summer where we had students trying to pull it in multiple different ways to see if different tools made it more effective. Pulling it by hand just seems to be the most effective thing. You can get it at low tide, or if you're diving, there's a lot to be collected in kind of the shallows of tidal too. But it's so the same genus is a big problem in the Caribbean. The species that are a problem in the Caribbean let go of the bottom and float around in big patches. Ours doesn't really do that too much. It stays attached. So the methods that one might use in the Caribbean are probably different. Does that cover it? Other sargassum questions? I love talking sargassum, so happy to talk about it more.
So can you show a picture?
Yeah, I think the only
Well, I
thing.
know, but I couldn't really.
So here, this is a tiny picture on the bottom right. You can see students collecting it from an old pipe. But this is on the bottom right here is what a frond of sargassum looks like.
So it has a little bulbs like kelp does?
It does, but they're really small.
Okay.
They're tiny. So a plant can grow to be as tall as me, taller. But the little gas bladders are no bigger than your pinky nail.
So that's how, if you see something like that, you can yank it.
I say yank it, yeah.
All right.
There is one species that's similar looking Cysticyra, but you really don't find it down here. It's mostly up. That's a native seaweed, but it's mostly up in like the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It's the closest I've seen it.
If you yank it and let it sit there, will it die or will it respawn?
If you just pull it and drop it on the beach, it will float, and it might start. Yeah, it might drop propagules and other places. So, what to do with it is really the question.
Take it home.
Take it home. It'll start to smell, which is why we dry it and integrate it into these different materials.
We'll bring it to you.
Maybe we'll do a sargassum seaweed pressing workshop, y'all.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Is it edible? It is edible. I wouldn't eat it. It's really addictive. It's so all seaweeds here, with the exception of Desmorestia, which are pretty common actually around like Point Defiance. They have sulfuric acid in them, so you don't ever want to eat them. But most seaweeds here are edible. Sargassum is edible. It is by far the most effective in sucking up metals and contaminants. So it's not one I would eat for sure. I think in Thailand they pickle it, but it wouldn't be.
So if it picks up the metals, is there any way to use that to clean this out?
That's kind of a hope. Yeah. So like pulling it out, taking both the carbon that it's absorbed, the excess nutrients, and the metals that are absorbed in its tissue, and integrating it into something that's not sequestered per se, but it's pulled out of the system to the extent that we can.
Is it all brown?
Is it what?
It says it's brown?
It's a brown seaweed. Yeah, it's related to fucus. It's in Fucales, family Fucales, so it's not a kelp, but it's closely related.
Okay.
The ill effects of it. I mean, it still provides like habitat, hiding locations.
Yeah, it
like
does.
similar to kelp, other than it's probably causing overgrowth, so now the kelp isn't growing anymore.
It's similar to kelp in a lot of ways. My guess is it's facilitating different species, but this is one of the studies we want to do. Well, I wanted to do it this summer, but I'm going on maternity leave, so that's not going to happen for a while, probably next year. I think when you are out at night, if you've ever, it sounds like some people have done night surveying and that type of thing, and you shine your light for the intertidal, and there are these bushy things, and it looks like there are tons of little shrimp eyes in it, that's usually sargassum. So I think it's probably harboring a different suite of organisms, not necessarily bad, but definitely, I think, a shift in composition. But again, that's something we need to research. It also gets really covered in diatom stuff, so it gets really fuzzy looking. So I think it might change some of the chemical processes. But yeah, for some species, herring, perhaps others, it can be of real value. And if we're going to pull it out, we need to make sure we're replacing it or seeding with something else that they can use. And pretty quickly. We don't want we don't want to pull something out and leave anyone out.
But the ill effects of it is just that it's not native and it's growing.
And is really
Taking over.
taking over, homogenous. It smothers other seeds.
What holds it in check in the Orient? What predator do we need to bring in?
Yeah, so not much eats it. Not much eats it. I mean, it forms these forests that are used for structural complexity, but they're not big in the way of as a food source, to my knowledge. It's the seasonality of it is what kind of keeps it in check. I think in its native habitat. So it's very much.
All right. Well, let's give Dr. Eliza Heery a big round of applause.